Hi everyone and welcome to our International Fintech Festival and today's panel, which is on AI for financial services. What I know from recent conversations with clients is that everyone in this sector has very high hopes for the benefits that AI technology might unlock. That might be better controls, efficiencies, a better customer experience overall. But I also know that many firms are treading carefully, very aware that missteps can be reputationally damaging and costly. So today we're going to take stock, and I'm joined by a distinguished panel of experts who are going to guide us through the labyrinth of the latest AI regulations and their implications for the financial services sector. So to introduce our panelists, I'm really pleased to be joined by Aman Thind, who is Executive Vice President and Global Chief Architect for State Street Corporation. State Street is one of the largest financial institutions in the world. It services nearly 10% of the world's assets. And in his role, Aman is responsible for defining State Street's technology strategy across all divisions and setting the roadmap for the bank's transformation into an innovation-led organization. He drives the bank's adoption of the latest AI, crypto, cloud, data strategies and is responsible for technical due diligence on all of the bank's potential partners. We're really pleased to have Aman with us today to provide his invaluable perspective. Secondly, I want to introduce James McPhillips. James is a partner in our tech digital practice based in the US, and he advises clients on a variety of industries on complex technology, commercial transaction, with a particular focus on digital transformation projects, cloud services transactions, and the procurement of AI systems. Next up, I want to introduce Boika Deleva. Boika is a senior associate in Clifford Chance's Luxembourg office. Boika specializes in banking and financial services regulation, advising both incumbents and startups in the financial market space to meet their tech challenges. And finally, I want to introduce Monica Freely. Monica is a senior associate in our London office. She specializes in financial services disputes, including advising clients on emerging regulatory enforcement action and liability issues around their use of technology. And finally, to introduce myself, I'm Kate Scott. I'm a technology litigation partner here in London at Clifford Chance. So, turning to the issue of the day, I think it's fair to say that actually in the last year, awareness of AI has absolutely exploded into the mainstream. Day on day in the press, we hear about big tech products like Microsoft's Copilot, ChatGPT, and Google's Gemini. But Aman, perhaps you can tell us in the financial services sector, how is the technology evolving? What's on the horizon?
I think ever since cloud came about, there has never been another technology which has taken off within financial services the way AI is right now. And all of the latest buzz is all credited towards generative AI. And the rationale behind that is, especially within financial services, we have been using AI for many, many years. But what Gen AI has allowed us to do and the partnerships that they've struck with the hyperscalers, cloud providers, is there is hundreds and millions of dollars worth of training that is being done on the large language models, which are now available for us to use for pennies across any of the cloud providers. What this has done is democratized access towards AI like never before. The other thing here is AI, just as a segment, used to be very, very fragmented across the board because depending upon what you want to do, you would use a different model to achieve what you are after. What large language models have been able to accomplish is a move towards artificial general intelligence in which they can actually help us accomplish many more things, a huge variety of things to a degree at which their outputs are deemed acceptable to actually start adding productivity towards everything, including financial services. And I think this is what has truly changed and moved the dial when it comes to the acceptance of AI within financial services. And right now, I don't know of any bank who is not working on their overall 1 year, 3 year strategy on how to use it in order to improve their productivity or reduce their costs.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Oh, sorry, Kate, if I could also just jump in, because I think what Aman has said is exactly right in my experience as well, where the transformation of what we've seen in the generative AI sense once ChatGPT was released about 1.5 years ago, where there was this sort of fear of what this generative AI technology could do and where one's data was going. And so there's a complete sort of lockdown at the beginning. But over the course of last year, there's been such an about face from this fear and sort of, let's lock it down, let's not use it, all the way to, through let's explore. And now we're getting questions from boards and executives saying, well, if we don't embrace generative AI, if we don't try to deploy it in our financial institution, for instance, then we could be left behind. And I think that transformation over the course of only a couple of calendar quarters was among the fastest embrace of technology that I think the world has just about ever seen. I mean, typically technology kind of evolves relatively slowly. In this case, it's gone quite rapidly. And I don't know, Aman, if you agree with that assessment, but I've seen that from clients across the last, call it 12 months.
That is precisely it, because apart from all the innovation on the technology, there has been innovation on the use of this technology. And large language models, just because of their structure, they are so easy to use, which is why every single incumbent out there has their own AI strategy. And this is why Copilot has become part of our vernacular, because every single application out there has a Copilot, because through generative AI, the ability to be able to generate new information based on all the learnings from whether it is the internal knowledge base of within your firm or all the information that is available outside. Like GPT-4 has been trained on 20% of all knowledge available to mankind. And being able to access all of that information in order to respond to your firm's needs, your clients' needs, it truly is revolutionary.
And what do you see as the key use cases? You've touched on a few of them, Aman. I mean, I know in discussions, we often focus on the distinction between the more internal use cases and the sort of customer or client-facing use cases. But what are your views, and where are you seeing innovation heading?
So in terms of the overall use cases, I think before we define the use cases, we need to define what truly is it about generative AI that sets it apart. And the moment we understand it, the use cases become very, very natural. So through generative AI, and the word generative itself has all the clues into what it does in its name itself. So it is able to generate new information based on all the information that it has ingested and learned from in the past. So what that allows you to do is things like document intelligence, because historically there have been numerous firms that have been created whose sole purpose has been to be able to understand documents and be able to then subsequently respond to queries against it. The entire business around private markets, anyone who's been successful at any rate, their investments have primarily been around trying to understand all the different prospectuses that float about within the space and trying to understand how to respond to it. What generative AI has allowed us to do is not just extract information from documents, but truly understand it and then subsequently respond against it. So what that means is if you have a large operations base, you can take the entire knowledge base of your operations. You can feed that into a chatbot-based interface. And then your junior-most employee who has just joined yesterday receives a query from one of your senior-most clients, and he can just ask this chatbot, how do I respond to this client query? And it would be able to give a very, very precise answer around that based on all the training. So document intelligence, knowledge base, all of these are like very key internal use cases which are being explored. The other thing here is around natural language processing, because if we think about it, every single programming language that we've ever created, all of these are just different dialects to speak to machines. Humans were never able to speak to machines, and that's why we created this entire cottage industry of IT to sit in between and act as translators between these two. Now, because of large language models, machines can actually finally understand the human language, what it is that we are trying to ask, and then subsequently respond against it. For example, if I went to a restaurant and had a lasagna and it was delicious, or I said I went to a restaurant and had a lasagna and it was beautiful, just based on all the training, it knows that the word delicious is used mostly in conjunction with food, and lasagna is food, and the word beautiful is mostly around interiors or exteriors, and hence that could be around the restaurant. And hence, without the need for parentheses, without the need for coming up with a brand new structure on how to process this human language, large language models are able to understand and then subsequently respond. This ability for natural language to replace programming language is the other theme which I see across the industry, which is instead of trying to create new SQL queries, instead of creating new visualizations, just marry your low-code, no-code interfaces with the ability for now machines to finally understand what you want and come up with interfaces wherein ask and you shall receive. And that, I think, is a real leap forward in terms of client experience and also gaining efficiency across the board.
Yeah, and Aman, in talking with clients, and I'd be curious about your views on this as well, but in talking to clients, it sounds like one of the really powerful elements of large language models and generative AI is the ability for these systems to read and understand all the unstructured data that an organization has. I mean, reams and vast petabytes worth of information of investment reports or just all the documents that a financial services or financial institution has, or a law firm has, for instance, like Clifford to be able to read understand that unstructured data, make it structured, so then it can be then used for other purposes, and use other AI technologies or other systems to really take advantage of all the data that you have. Is that how you're seeing it as well?
That is precisely it, because using this as a way to translate unstructured to structured, and then subsequently delivering not just information, but actually the underlying insights from that information. Because the biggest challenge of going from unstructured to structured is you will always lose the texture of the data, because the reason why it was unstructured in the first place is because there is a lot of surround sound and information which your data model never lent itself to. So anytime you simply extract information and put it in a database table, yes, you have achieved the unstructured to structured, but you have probably lost 95% of the underlying intelligence behind the document that you've just extracted the data from. So there is a lot of juice within these documents which is being left behind. But now, instead of simply going after unstructured to structured, now, what is happening is taking all your structured information, taking all your unstructured information, and actually translating it into vectors and vector embeddings, which can subsequently be accessed and interrogated and brought to light by large language models. That is a change in how we've been thinking about data and how we've been thinking about data models, which truly just completely remove the barrier itself. That bring one, bring all, and you would be able to ask questions and deliver insights from each and every one of them. And that is really going to change how we not just ingest information, but also store information, process information, and then most importantly, how do we extract value from that information? Because the problem has never been the lack of data. In fact, I would argue that we've had too much data, that we've been paying too much for storage, but anytime you actually need to deliver any insights from it, you don't have the compute or the capacity to be able to do it. Convert it all into vectors, perhaps build some foundation models around it, and every single information in your entire firm and every public information that's ever been out there is now at your fingertips to deliver value from, which is a great time to be alive in.
But it's certainly a really exciting time for fintechs and the financial services industry. I mean, the potential that you've just outlined, Aman, is enormous. But I think what I'm interested in is how is regulation of this new technology keeping pace with those technological developments? And what we were going to turn to now was looking around the globe and starting with the EU. So Boika, perhaps you could update us on the EU AI Act and its current status. I think hot off the press, I understand that the EU Parliament voted in favour of adoption just yesterday, so our session today is well timed. But perhaps you could tell us more.
Yeah, sure. I think the EU itself has positioned itself actually at the front line with the landmark EU AI Act, which is certainly a first of a kind as it sets out the regulatory framework around AI, and more specifically on the placing on the market, putting into service and the use of AI systems in and that affect the EU market. I think an interesting peculiarity of the EU AI Act is that it adopts a product safety approach and treats AI systems as products. We would tend to view them as software, I think. And although it has at its core fundamental rights protection and safeguards, and still tries to ensure future-proof regulation, especially for this fast-evolving technology. I can touch upon the timeline for the EU AI Act shortly, but as you mentioned, it is not yet in force and not yet, let's say, applicable law. But actually, after almost 3 years, I can say now in April, discussions between the EU co-legislators, the political agreement was reached in December last year. And indeed, the Council adopted the text in February, and as you mentioned, the Parliament just yesterday. I think the publication in the official journal will probably happen in the next few months. And as such, what the EU AI Act does is that it sets the legally binding rules and requirements for AI systems and models, which affect actors across the whole AI value chain. And these, of course, include financial institutions. And given its global reach, the AI Act will not be limited only to EU-based financial institutions, but it will also include non-EU providers that place AI systems on the EU market, and non-EU providers, or as the Act calls them, deployers of AI systems where the output of the AI system is intended to be used in the EU.
Thanks, Boika. So global institutions are going to need to grapple and understand with these rules. I mean, I remember one of the key debates actually at an earlier stage was actually the definition of AI. I know that when we looked at the early proposals, actually we were pretty concerned that actually the definition that was being adopted at that time might capture really all sorts of automated software, even sort of spreadsheet functionality used routinely by banks. And I'm interested to know actually, where have we landed?
Yeah, sure. Indeed, no, indeed. I think the first proposed definition by the Commission was indeed very, very broad. But now, the definition that is going to be adopted is actually aligned with the OECD definition of AI system, and without reading actually the definition, I think it has certain key elements, and it is actually refers to, let's say, machine-based system that is designated to operate on an autonomous level, so with the varying levels of autonomy, and that makes a bit adaptiveness after its deployment and going around the generative AI that we heard about before. But it can then infer from the input that it receives generate actually outputs, predictions, content, and even decisions that can influence physical or virtual environment. So indeed, simple spreadsheets will not be covered. I think banks can be happy about that, and also other financial institutions, and more generally, let's say, actors that will be captured by the scope of the AI Act. And without going into too much details, I think in summary, the core of the legislation is that it will establish obligations for all players in the AI system value chain, namely the product manufacturers, so those that actually develop the AI system, but also the providers, the deployers, so the people that actually use it, importers and distributors. And here we see this product point about the AI system. And with certain exceptions, you may have heard that the AA Act actually follows a risk-based approach, which is articulated around the prohibition of certain AI systems that actually the legislators thinks that are unacceptable. And as an example, I can say the real-time remote, I mentioned the real-time remote biometric identification in public spaces. However, and these are listed specifically in the AI Act. However, the main bulk of the requirements are around high-risk AI systems, and these there are specific systems that are listed explicitly as high risk, and others where institutions need to actually classify those. And the requirements include a number of rules around conformity assessments, risk and quality management, data governance, documentation, you name it. One very important one, I think, especially for users and customers of financial institution, are the rules around transparency. And specifically that so customers would need to know that they are actually treating with an AI system, or for instance a chatbot, and the very famous infamous deep fakes that would need to be then mentioned, that this is actually something that is generated by AI. And maybe without during the legislative process, actually, one of the main, let's say, rules that have also evolved are around generative AI. And there, these are actually additions to the original commission proposal, and these are tailored to follow a tiered system that actually includes additional requirements for general purpose AI models with systemic risks. Finally, the AI Act sets out also certain general principles which will be applicable to all AI systems. And maybe just to note on the timeline, it has a gradual application. So it has a 24 months transitional period. And one can think that, oh, that's quite a long time now from now. But there are certain exceptions, and the prohibition, for instance, for the of certain AI systems will apply just 6 months after the entry into force. So this can happen actually already the end of this year. The provisions around generative AI will apply 12 months after the entry into force, and the obligations around high-risk AI systems will apply only after 36 months after the entry into force of the AI Act. So all this timeline and gradual application should be taken into account by financial institutions when looking how to adapt their processes to comply with the requirements.
Thanks. So actually what's helpful is that there is a little bit of time for firms to take stock of what they need to do, and we'll come on to in a second, and how they embed those processes alongside existing financial services regulation. But what do you think actually are the key areas that firms and fintechs should be focusing on? What might be actually the high risk use cases in this sector, and how might there be challenges in terms of firms' compliance with those rules?
Yeah, sure. I think the financial sector more generally has been identified as one of these sectors where AI could have a significant impact. And currently, even financial institutions use numerous AI-based systems ranging from, let's say, detection of fraud. We have heard certainly robo-advisors, algorithmic trading, credit scoring, quite important one. And without getting, I think, into questions around AI governance or contracting around AI solutions, I think there are several key elements a firm needs to focus, and these are around first identifying whether the AI tool or the IT tool that it uses actually would qualify as an AI system within the meaning of the EU AI Act. Then, if so, classify such AI system, notably verify whether it is a high risk AI system, because as I mentioned, it is there where the main requirements are actually in the legislation, and then also whether it employs a general purpose AI model, because there are specific requirements in relation to these models. And maybe finally, the institution itself should identify its own role within the value chain of the AI system, as there are specific rules depending on whether such institution is, let's say, seen as a product manufacturer, provider, deployer, distributor, and especially this is especially relevant where the AI system qualifies as a high risk AI system. Maybe just to focus a bit more on the two last points. Um, the second one is the assessment whether the institution actually deploys or places on the market a high risk AI system. And here, so the AI Act lists certain AI systems which are high risk, but for others, the institution has to carry out the analysis itself, and then, of course, has to document it in case there are, let's say, questions by regulators. But an example maybe I can mention, there are certainly ones like traditional banking tools around algorithms used for the assessing of the customer credit worthiness or establishing a credit score. These are very, very frequently used, and these will be high risk AI systems. And hence the whole framework around included in the AI Act will apply to the institution that use these systems. Of course, others will be biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, and maybe even not going towards customers, but even only used for recruitment and selecting personnel. That certainly would also be a high risk AI system. Maybe one positive note to that is fraud detection. AI systems will not classify it as high risk. So that is specifically excluded in the legislation. So even if in certain instances, let's say there are easy examples, a clear cut may be difficult to be established, and then the institutions would actually need to consider and go into a deep dive into the specifics of the system in order to be able to carry out proper assessment. And there, of course, they may need to go back to their AI solution provider to be able to carry out the assessment. And I think especially when they need to qualify their role within, let's say, the AI value chain, there it may seem like a straightforward one. Of course, they are they are, let's say, deployer of the AI system, but that is not necessarily as easy as it sounds, and especially maybe to name group-wide applications. Let's say many companies within a financial sector group may be subject to the obligations under the AI Act in different capacities or roles. One can be a deployer, but others can actually be seen as providers or importers, depending on where they sit, even geographically. And this may make it difficult to identify what, let's say, the capabilities and the capacities in which they act and the obligations to which they are subject under the AI Act are. So it certainly merits, let's say, a more detailed analysis. Then also, if an institution internally establishes substantial modifications and tailors the AI system for its own purpose, it may be seen as provider and not only as a deployer of the AI system, and then additional requirements will be triggered. So that is something to be noted. And finally, just to note, banks are already subject to existing governance framework, including under the Capital Requirements Directive. So these sectoral legislations will continue to apply, and the AI Act just sits on top of those. So certainly, given the importance of the rules and of course the enforcement measures and the fines that are defined within the AI Act, it is certainly advisable to proactively evaluate and assess and map the use of the AI systems. And maybe not to discourage, certainly, but the AI Act is one piece within this broader regulatory landscape that we will discuss, I think, today. And it also includes other pieces of legislation like GDPR or AI Liability Directive, which is also forthcoming.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's lots of food for thought, and I wanted to actually provide a contrast by turning to James to see, is that mirrored in the US? What is the latest regulatory position? Perhaps you might give us a bit of an overview of perhaps the Biden administration's executive order and how that compares.
Sure. Thank you, Kate. And Boika, thank you for that overview of the EU AI Act, because as we often do in many things, the United States has taken a slightly different direction, at least as it relates to the regulation of AI. As Aman mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that AI is not new. I mean, some of the newest technologies, like generative AI, are new, which has triggered some additional scrutiny from regulators in the U.S. But the way that the U.S. is tackling this is effectively most of the regulators here are relying on existing rules, laws, and frameworks that are already on the books and planning to use those regulations to enforce AI at the moment. So, for instance, the SEC and the CFTC, the CFPB, a number of financial regulators are using their existing authorities to regulate AI like they have been before even generative AI has come out. As Kate mentioned, though, the Biden administration in October issued a sweeping executive order, which was pretty interesting. It's not something that happens that regularly in the U.S., where such a sweeping executive order is issued. Directing, it contains a number of different principles and kind of approaches, but effectively what it does is direct the various agencies across the federal government to come back with, and there are various deadlines for each agency, to come back with better direction on how how the government uses AI itself and how it's planning to regulate regulated entities. So, for instance, the Department of Treasury was directed to come back with guidance as to how it views AI regulation as it relates to cyber risk in particular. And that deadline is the end of this month in March. So we've not seen that guidance yet, but I think financial institutions who are regulated in the U.S. Should look out for that in the coming weeks from the Department of Treasury. So from the legislative standpoint, the U.S. Congress has not really advanced legislation in any meaningful sense. There have been some proposals on that front, but clearly nothing that approaches the scope or kind of the immediacy of how the EU Parliament has enacted the AI Act. So I think just to sum it up, the U.S. is taking a different approach, less on the legislative front, more on the regulation through enforcement approach from the federal government. I also know too, of course, in the U.S. we've got 50 states, and there are a number of regulators throughout each state, and we're seeing a lot of states start to issue guidance and regulation through their authorities. So it's like a lot of things in the U.S. Is likely to end up, at least for now, in a patchwork fashion as it comes out of the states, similar to, in a lot of ways, privacy laws. So the U.S. has certainly taken a different direction so far on this.
Thanks, James. And perhaps just to complete the picture, certainly in the UK, we are looking at existing legislation, existing regulation on a sectoral basis. Although, will that change? At the end of 2023, we had an artificial intelligence regulation bill proposed as a private member's bill in the House of Lords, and that proposed the creation of an AI authority to ensure that regulators in different sectors were taking a coordinated approach to AI, potentially a review of existing law. interesting proposals actually in relation to independent AI auditors and potentially a designated AI officer. So interesting proposals there, but at the moment in this sector, as well as specific regulations such as the GDPR in the context of data, for example, most firms will be focused on financial services regulation. And really what I see is one of the biggest challenges is knitting together, for example, for firms operating across the EU, in the UK and the US, is knitting together that sort of sectoral regulation alongside AI specific regulation, and then the full framework of other legislative provisions. So we've been just giving a quick snapshot, and I'm going to take UK regulated firms as an example. They need to comply with existing financial regulatory principles in their use of AI. They might, for example, need to consider when buying in AI, existing outsourcing rules, the operational resilience of such technology. And that's really because the FCA and PRA are seeking to ensure that the use of AI in the sector doesn't cause market disruption or systemic risk, and is particularly focused on looking at the interconnectivity between AI systems and the potential for AI-induced firm failures, and quite honestly, that there are contingency plans in place. It's worth touching on individual accountability regimes in that context. The existing senior managers regime will encompass responsibility for AI. There's no dedicated SMF for AI, but that's being discussed alongside a certification regime. And the FCA and PRA have been pretty proactive. They have an AI public-private forum. They've published a number of discussion papers. They've sought feedback. And actually, those publications are quite useful. They give a bit of a snapshot on the state of the market, and they obviously provide some informal guidance to firms. But I was going to turn to Monica for really a bit more guidance around, what the latest messaging looks like from those UK regulators.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. So yeah, there are, I'd say, three key themes worth bringing out from the various public-facing reports and guidance from the UK regulators. And these are also themes that we've touched on in the context of the EU AI Act. So despite different sort of approaches and ways of approaching how to regulate across the jurisdictions, there is sort of consistency and alignment of the principles and the themes. So the first key theme that has already come up today is transparency. So consistent with the EU AI Act, the FCA has been very clear on various occasions that customers must know when and how machines are involved in making decisions, and that AI should only be used if a customer consents. And the FCA has produced reports with the UK's Turing Institute on use of AI in financial services. And again, the emphasis and the focus of those reports was the need to make information about AI systems available and to be utterly open and transparent. Another theme that's very clear in the UK and globally is that of governance. So Kate mentioned the senior managers regime. In the governance context in the UK, I thought it's also important to mention the FCA's consumer duty rules, which have been enforced since July 2023. And they require firms to play a greater role in ensuring good outcomes for their retail customers, avoiding harm, and enabling those customers to pursue their financial goals. And the FCA has explicitly stated that these frameworks provide the tools needed to address material risks associated with AI, even though they don't specifically refer to AI. And then another third theme I wanted to touch on is apportionment of liability, which regulators are conscious of, and it's a tricky issue, and we'll come on to it later because it's an interesting one. But just in that context, it's helpful that UK regulators sort of unanimously across the board of the FCA, PRA, and Bank of England, they've each clearly set out their intention to regulate critical third parties in connection with their provision of AI to the financial sector. And they play a huge role for these third parties. So it's positive that that's been recognised, and it's really a watch this space to see how that regulation evolves.
Thanks, Monica. And Aman, you're hearing all of these views from all the jurisdictions, all imposing different requirements. How do you see it from somebody who's at the coalface? You know, how is State Street looking at this?
So one of the challenges, which I think is subtle, but hopefully if anyone is listening in carefully will be able to tell, is that all the regulations that we are talking about are on usage of AI, while creation of AI is something where there is still a huge lack of clarity. And by that, what I mean is, for example, if I'm using OpenAI models, then I know based on all these regulations across all the jurisdictions what I can and cannot do. But if OpenAI is being sued by George R.R. Martin because someone decided to create 2 new unreleased versions of Game of Thrones using OpenAI models, and George Martin is saying that the only way that it can create a new Game of Thrones is that it has read every single Game of Thrones, then does that lawsuit actually bleed on to my usage of OpenAI models? And that is something which is not very clear in the industry, both in terms of whether I'll be indemnified from all this usage and lawsuit, but then also, why are there these lawsuits? Why do they even exist? Because all the regulations that are currently being worked upon are like an advancement of existing data regulations. And data regulations are primarily around making sure that there is clear ownership, that owners get value, and then there is localization of that data for sensitive information. But generative AI, it's like a child. It learns something new every single day, and based on that, it will give you a different answer depending upon what was the last book that it read. Now, if it has, for example, if I have read all of George Martin's books and sometimes responding to emails from some of the colleagues, if I use some of the words or style that he has, then am I plagiarizing? That is effectively what the large language models are doing. If they've seen all the videos on YouTube, if they've read every text on the internet, then when they're producing new content, then where is the attribution? Who owns the rights to the data that all of these models have been trained on? And if there are lawsuits, then how do we completely address them? That is still unclear. And because of that, even though the technology itself holds huge potential, and even though the regulations are very quickly forming, and even if we comply to them, just because the origin story itself on language models and the training has not been clarified, I think we would still be tiptoeing around in the space before we truly go live.
No, thank you. We're going to come back to some of those disputes themes in a minute, including some of the IP aspects. I mean, those are some of the challenges. So you're looking forward to the risks and the concerns around them. James, how are you seeing those legislative regulatory developments translate into practical issues? And previously you focused on procuring AI, various use cases, and really what should firms be looking at in the context of procurement? Aman drew a distinction there between sort of creating the technology and using it, and in the middle is obviously the buying in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kate. And so I think that the way I think about it, and I think a lot of financial institutions and our clients are thinking about it, is almost sequentially, right? So there are thousands of potential use cases. In fact, talking to a global financial institution client the other day, that they've got, I think, a kind of an inventory of over 10,000 potential use cases and thousands of different models that they're exploring. So you take one of those use cases and you sort of think about the life cycle of how do you go from the idea of using it. So let's say we want to deploy a chatbot in our kind of internal environment to help facilitate conducting investment research. So you have this idea, well, how do you get it to actual deployment? And so there's a journey, of course. So there's the use case idea, and I think a lot of clients and financial institutions are setting up a governance kind of framework and a process for carrying that through to execution. And so there are issues around, okay, well, what kind of model do we want to use for this idea? What's the cost? We need to do diligence on this on the potential options here in terms of what we might want to do versus, in terms of buy versus build. Do we want to go out and buy a foundational model or the access to a foundational model? And what do we build around that? And so there's all these sorts of operational and technical questions that come at the beginning. And I mentioned a governance framework where, clients are setting up a framework that is usually not bespoke to AI, not a wholly separate new kind of framework. Usually it's sort of being addressed as a bolt-on to existing processes, a lot of times model risk frameworks and other kind of existing processes, because as we mentioned in the regulatory conversation, that there are already a number of processes in place and regulations that financial institutions need to meet, and so we're effectively bolting on kind of an AI component to this. So, that use case that I described will go through the governance framework and say, okay, well, is this a high or medium or low risk use case? If it's high, it might get directed to an AI governance officer or a steering committee or however the organization has set that up to review and decide as an organization, do we want to take on that risk? Or are we allowed to use AI in this way if it's high risk? And so there's a thoughtful decision that's made in that respect. Now, there may be low risk use cases where it doesn't have to go through a whole governance escalation process because as I mentioned, there are thousands of potential options. We want to start to create efficiencies and be able to fast track low risk use cases, for instance. And of course, medium is somewhere in the middle. So you get through that process, and then you get sort of toward the end, like you would in any technology procurement. You conduct due diligence. You think, okay, do we have a contract in place if we're purchasing AI systems in this case? And then and if you do have an existing contract, well, was that negotiated with AI issues in mind? Some of these IP issues that Aman mentioned. Does the output of this generative AI system, for instance, by contract, does the bank own that, or do we have to go back to the service provider and negotiate a fix to that issue? Or addressing things like security risk. I mean, is there a risk of data poisoning here? Do we have to beef up our contractual security protections or conduct further security due diligence? And then ultimately, you sign a deal, or maybe the existing contract is already suited to be able to make that purchase. So there's sort of a life cycle in getting from idea to deployment that I think clients are adjusting their existing processes to account for it. And again, not wholly remaking their internal processes necessarily, but really kind of modifying it and making sure that these new regulations are accounted for and other commercial practices are accounted for. So that's what I'm seeing in discussions and working with our clients on this.
And picking up that theme of governance, Boika, turning back to you, I mean, how are firms implementing that, and how are they focusing potentially on some of the ethics issues, including when building their own AI models?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kate. I think before even going into the specifics, I'd like just to echo something I heard at the opening of the FinTech Festival by John Hinshaw of HSBC. I think he gave some great pointers, especially on governance. And I very much liked the idea of establishing a partnership with technology. And actually, it just builds upon what James mentioned. A key pillar and a starting point for the use of AI systems is indeed setting out the firm's AI strategy and governance framework. And that is something that is already required under existing, let's say, financial sector legislation. But it is, again, let's say, gold-plated by the EU, will be by the EU AI Act. And there, let's say, there are number of principles that firms, and especially the ones that would like to build their own AI system, would need to take into account. So an institution that would seek to develop an AI model would need to indeed determine its risk tolerance and approach to digital ethics. So that means that in terms of even personnel and internal bodies, they would not only need, let's say, existing personnel like technology let's say, technology staff, but also people that have knowledge around fundamental rights, ethics, and are able not only to focus on the business needs of the institution, but also to navigate this really thin line between the technology advancement, the business need of the institution, but also the safeguards of fundamental rights. Because I think at the core of the EU AI Act is the let's say, ensuring ethical principles are complied with, and there is a human oversight or a human in the loop. And I know in discussion with clients that has been really difficult to ensure, because what exactly a human in the loop means in a specific AI use case. But certainly transparency and explainability are other key principles that institutions would need to take into account. A crucial role will play the determining of the data sets and avoiding biases and discriminations, and not only in a testing environment, but also once the AI system is deployed into the market. So all we know, a robust AI governance strategy has to be aligned, of course, with the business objectives of the institutions. And we see that AI certainly presents new opportunities, especially around the use of Gen AI, which certainly enhance the customer experience because they tailor solutions specific to each individual in certainly few seconds. But this has to be done while also avoiding biases and discriminations, and that can be a complex task. So just to go back to the EU AI Act, it sets out a number of requirements around the model testing and the validation, and also the continuous monitoring and the assessment of the AI system, especially in order to ensure that these requirements are complied with. And hence an institution needs to set out a specific policy and procedure, not only for, let's say, the whole IT system and resilience and cybersecurity, but also specifically around its use of AI. And of course, this has to be applied hand in hand with the existing requirements around data protection and privacy, but of course, cybersecurity, IP, and business continuity.
Thanks, Boika. I'm going to pick up a theme that Aman seeded earlier, which is disputes and what do we think those disputes are going to look like. I mean, first up, actually, the nature of the dispute is going to be influenced by the use case in this sector. So where AI is brought in, who's liable for the errors, IP disputes, as Aman mentioned, he gave an example. I was going to give another one actually, which was the Getty Images case. They're suing Stability AI, which automatically generates images, and Getty's really complaining about how its images have been used as data inputs for training purposes, and in doing so that the assertion is that reproduces Getty's copyright works. That's heading to trial in the English courts imminently. You've then got, as James has highlighted, the kind of contract framework and the contract disputes that are going to come out of that. You know, where things have gone wrong, you're going to need a clear delineation of responsibility. You're also going to need to look at the indemnities, warranties, all of the usual contractual protections. I think Boika talked about robo-advice earlier. We've yet to see a large number of disputes in this space, but there has been one case in the English courts called Tindaris and VWM, where actually a portfolio of investments was being managed using an AI system to predict market sentiments with no human intervention. And when losses ensued, VWM asked Tindaris to suspend trading. So the actual dispute was about loss of fees, the alleged misrepresentations, but had that case proceeded, the court would have had to look at the AI technology. And that dispute is several years old now. That was in 2017. But since then, we've talked about how generative AI has the potential to deliver advice to clients directly, potentially at its extreme, cutting out the human investment advisor. And I know firms are approaching this cautiously, but actually what you need to do is assess the matrix of risk. You need to apply your kind of existing lens of claims and think about actually how the technology makes a difference. Now, my own view is it doesn't make a difference to the nature of the claims that we'll see. For example, we will still see claims in relation to negligent advice, but actually, how are you going to evidence that? And I know Monica has some thoughts on it, which she is going to come to imminently. That's a retail context. Stepping back, if you look at the wholesale markets within trading teams, machine learning models are being used to predict trading patterns, to analyze central bank statements or speeches. They're being used in algo trading. They're using to identify patterns to execute trades at high speed. And really firms need to make sure there that they have the appropriate systems and controls in place to make sure they're not committing market abuse, they're not engaging in anti-competitive conduct. You'll face queries from the financial regulators if you get it wrong, enforcement action, and obviously follow-on claims in the civil courts. I think another important area is GDPR-related claims. Both Boika and James have highlighted both the sort of data privacy aspects, and obviously banks hold huge amounts of personal data. In a data context, obviously the relevant regulator is the ICO that's published numerous guidance on AI and data protection. And I think we really do expect to see some data misuse claims in relation to use of AI. There may be in some jurisdictions like the UK difficulties in getting big class actions off the ground, but we do know that actually AI is a focus of litigation funders who essentially make those claims happen. And rights under the GDPR, such as Article 22, which gives people the right not to be subject to solely automated decisions, including profiling, and Article 15 of the GDPR about confirmation of about where your personal data is being processed, mean that actually we will see those claims and are seeing those claims in some jurisdictions, like the Netherlands, where actually automated decision making and profiling by taxi firms has already been scrutinized by the Dutch courts. But Monica, I've touched on and given a very quick canter view some of those issues, but how do you see firms avoiding those liability issues or really equipping themselves to provide a robust response to litigants?
Thanks, Kate. I think in the time available, I will just I'll make it as quick as I can. I think the main word is explanations. There's been messaging from regulators across the globe, and it was also clear in the EU AI Act that being able to explain and understand the AI tools you are using is absolutely key. In the UK, the ICO has put out guidance appropriately named Project Explain. It's no less than 145 pages long, so I will certainly not go into detail on it. But the key message is that you need to understand how your AI works, and it needs to be capable of being thoroughly interrogated. Whether you need to involve experts in that or not is, experts might be able to assist, but you have to have something that is capable of being interrogated. And there's sort of two case studies that I'll mention as they show sort of contrasting approaches to the amount of information that was available to explain the tools being used. So many of you will know about the Apple credit card investigation in New York, following complaints that credit limits were biased against women. But the case also has some very interesting takeaways about explanations. It was an incredibly thorough investigation that involved reviewing thousands of pages of records for approximately 400,000 applicants. And the regulator found no evidence of gender discrimination because, well, the bank was able to show how it had reached the decision for each customer. And it had clear policies in place to ensure that to mitigate bias and to avoid discrimination, as it had a very robust and comprehensive set of documents to provide to the regulator. And then in contrast, the Deliveroo algorithm that was the subject of a dispute in the Italian courts was capable of much less rigorous interpretation, and it was found to have been discriminatory. And the court held that Delivery was able to and should have trained the algorithm not to discriminate, and the fact that Delivery was unable to explain how the algorithm worked certainly contributed to the decision of the court. And while that case concerned an algorithm, it's informative of the approach. And I suppose the takeaway, if you will, is that courts are unlikely to look favorably on an organization that cannot explain how their technology works. So yeah, I would say explanations are a key area to focus on, and documentation as well, which might not be surprising to those who've been involved in this before.
Thank you, Monica. And I'm mindful of time, so I think we're going to move to wrap up, perhaps with one final observation from Aman. I'm conscious of those who've asked questions in the chat. I think we've largely picked those up, but we will obviously reflect on them, and where we can, we will get back to you. But Aman, I mean, perhaps to give you the closing word, looking to the future, what do you think is going to be the most significant challenge in relation to AI for this sector over the next 5 years?
I think the most significant challenge, and Monica just touched upon it as well, is around explainability. We have created technology and we have created a feedback loop such that we can look at the results from that technology, but generating a complete understanding of how those results are being created, generating an understanding of how these models are actually functioning behind the scenes, because sometimes we just keep feeding it new data and looking at the output with like marvel. But the thing is, the regulators would never be comfortable with it, and neither financial institutions, that we will feed all the data into these models and just hope that the technology delivers what we expect it to do. So a lot of research is still required in order to generate better explainability and predictability of the final outcomes from these models. And based on all the work that we are doing with all our partners in AI, we know that that is a key area of focus. So we do expect it to happen, and it's just a matter of time. But one thing that we need to realize is that it's a pretty key moment. It's just that we have been hearing about AI for such a long time that it does not feel that revolutionary when we just speak about it, apart from all the hype around all the use cases and all the tweets people keep sending about what are the different applications of these technologies. But fundamentally, this is a pivotal moment. This is a pivotal moment for humanity, just like the invention of calculators was, or internet was, or mobile phones was. This is now a tool which will be available at our disposal, which can help us do everything better. And it is almost the responsibility of humans to use this to augment our own capabilities to just deliver better humanity, to deliver that utopia. But in order to be able to do that, we just need to make sure that we train it in the right manner. And the only unfortunate part in this entire exercise is these large language models learn from data, and that data has been generated by humans, and humans are fundamentally flawed. But what we see is that the large language models are actually being held to a higher bar than we hold humans. Because if a language model cannot generate the images of a right skin tone, then it is a death sentence for that language model right there. So as there are further innovation within this space such that they finally manage to strike the right balance around religious and political affiliations, around what right truly means, and once it starts becoming something that can start augmenting us, no matter what our sphere of influence is and what we work on, I think this true pivotal moment of technological innovation would finally be realized, and I think it'll change everything that we do forever.
And on that note, thank you very much, Aman. Thank you very much to all of our panelists today, and thank you very much for joining us. Sorry for running slightly over time. Just a reminder before we go, we've got our keynote closing coming up later this afternoon at 3 p.m. GMT. There we're going to be listening to Commissioner of the US CFTC, Caroline Pham. So very exciting talk coming up this afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon. Goodbye.